Alright, so we are carrying on from where we left off. We were discussing plays and playwriting, and last time we were focusing on specifically types of plays, and I'm trying to use this as a way of bridging the gap from, 3,000 years ago to where we are now. So one of the important choices that a playwright has to make when they are sitting down to write a play is what kind of play they want to write, how they want to tell their story to an audience. I walked you through the plot of the Greek play Medea by Euripides last time, and kind of defined the elements of tragedy, how to recognize a tragedy if you see one. Tragedy is the oldest form of theater that we have in Western civilization. It sort of is the thing that kicks the whole ball of wax rolling down the hill and off and moving. And so, yeah, it's super important, which is why I went back over it. The second oldest form of theater shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to anybody, but it's comedy, right? We had tragedy and comedy right from the beginning. So, even with the giant wooden tiki head mask that they would wear in ancient Greece, the actors, frowny face and the smiley face, the comedy and tragedy masks. So yeah, comedies have been around for a really long time, probably as old as tragedy. We don't know how the first comedy plays began, how they were first performed, like we do with tragedy with Thespis, but they have been there for a long time. The ancient Greeks had comedies. They didn't necessarily serve the same religious function that the tragedies did, which is why Aristotle was perhaps more fond of tragedies, but comedy was an important part of Greek play life. The comedies were popular back then, and that actually speaks to something true about life. There is only so much weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth that one can take. Like, tragedy in ancient Greece, there's no humor in it whatsoever. Like, they have no comedic relief, they don't lighten the tone. It is nothing but doom, gloom, depression, disaster, and in the right tragedy plays, incest. Yeah, whereas, in comedies were popular back then, they are popular now. Nobody does strict pure tragedy anymore these days because audiences just can't take it. You just get sick and tired of it. There is only so much weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Classical tragedy has gone away as a form. It starts everything that we like, but pure tragedy doesn't exist anymore. You just don't find it done or written like that. Even if you're doing something tragic these days, a play that is tragic, you will break up the tension with comedic relief. Yeah, there will be elements of light mixed in with all the dark. So tragedies fade away in popularity over time, pure tragedy. Comedies were popular back then, they are popular now, and they have only continued to be so. Comedies have filled the seats for thousands of years, and they may have changed somewhat in terms of style over the years, but they have always kept people coming to see it. So comedies are popular. They were back then, they are now. If you're following along on the slideshow, if you look at slide 16, I have put the front cover of a classical comedy from ancient Greece. The play is called Lysistrata, and I'll walk you through the basics of it in a second. It's by the playwright Aristophanes. This is written late in the height of Greek theater period, so 150, 200 years after, say, Oedipus the King. So there are differences in how comedies were performed back then. I described the elements of acting in Greek tragic theater. Comedies would be sung the same way that all theater was sung back then. But unlike tragedy, in tragedy the actors, they are wearing the giant wooden tiki head mask with the primary emotion carved on the mask so that the audience can see even from far away. They are wearing, 3-foot-tall Lady Gaga wooden platform shoes to give them more height, the actors in tragedy. So the actors in comedy don't necessarily do those things. They may wear the masks sometimes, but not always. But they don't wear the platform shoes. They don't have those same wooden adornments to help them portray their character as they act. They will wear things in comedies. There's a comedy from back then called The Birds, which is a satire on bureaucracy. And the actors in that comedy would adorn themselves with like feathers to be a bird. The play isn't really about birds, it's about making fun of politicians and bureaucrats, but if the wrong politician or bureaucrat catches on that they're being made fun of, they'll lock you up and kill you. So instead, you just say, oh no, that's not making fun of you. This was about a bird. And so yeah, they would wear feathers and things like that. It depends on the show what they would wear. Lysistrata, by Aristophanes, the one that I'm going to walk you through the basics of real fast, they also did wear adornments to the costumes, some of the characters, some of the actors in the performance. They didn't wear the masks, they didn't have platform shoes. They do have the use of a wooden adornment, all right, giant wooden penises. That is what I'm building up to, okay? Giant wooden penises, because old people are filthy dirty. Lysistrata by Aristophanes was a popular play back then. It is still relatively popular because it's an anti-war play. In the play, the army of Greece is constantly at war with all of its neighbors. They go off and fight a neighboring country, they win that war, they come home to see their wives and refresh themselves, and then they're off to the next fight, to the next country, they're over, and the wives get sick of it. So the wife of the head general, Lysistrata, she decides to lead the other wives of the officer soldiers on a strike. They use the only power that they can, certainly at the time. Lysistrata and all the other wives say to their husbands when one war is done and they come back to refresh themselves with their wives, Lysistrata says and gets the other wives to unify and say, nope, no sex for you until you're not fighting anymore. Until there's peace, there will be no sex had. So the actors who are playing the males in the play, and bear in mind, yes, there are female characters, they are not played by females because for the Greeks, that's just gross. How can you even suggest such a thing that a woman play the woman part? Yeah, no, it's played by a guy in like a mask or a costume that would reflect female. Anyway, all the actors who are playing the male parts, they have these giant wooden penises on the front of their costumes, and like at the beginning of the play when, you know, the strike starts and they're denied sex, the phalluses are relatively normal sized, but then the longer the strikes go on, because, you know, when confronted with, you know, no sex for you until there's peace, the men, you know, clamp down, get all prideful and like, well, I'm not listening to you. And so, yeah, the wives try to turn them on, and they get more and more desperate, and then finally, by the end of the play, like, you know, they switch out the phalluses, and the giant wooden penises are, like, as big as the guys carrying them around on the front of their costumes. Because, yeah, it's ridiculous, it's funny, and it is completely filthy. I have seen productions that lack the phallus element, but they just, I don't know, they just lose their power for me. Filthy as it is, it's just funny to see a bunch of guys walking around with giant wooden penises on the front of their costumes. Lysistrata, like I said, was popular back when it was performed originally, but people still do Lysistrata all the time. I saw a version of it done during the Lysistrata War. Yeah, it feels very contemporary in its anti-war sentiments, and so, yeah. But, you know, the giant wooden penis element is partially why I'm not showing you any clips and or imagery from productions of the show, because I like my job and don't want to get fired. But again, old people, don't listen to them when they're like, oh, SpongeBob SquarePants is so weird, you guys watch bad things. Yeah, old people, filthy, filthy, dirty. Probably especially your grandparents. Alright, so here's the funny thing about comedy back in the classical world. Comedies didn't necessarily have to be funny, right? In the same way that I explained last time that the word drama, all plays are dramas, right? Even the funny ones. So if it's a play, if it's a funny play, it's still a drama because all plays are dramas. It's important for class, at least, to understand that our modern usage of the word comedy is kind of different from the way that ancient Greek and Roman playwrights were using it originally. For us, a comedy is a play that attempts to amuse its audience, to make people laugh, whatever. But back then, there were two types of theater. There was tragedy, and then there was comedy. So, comedy was a term that was used to describe any play that was not a tragedy. So, if it wasn't a tragedy, it was comedy. It didn't necessarily have to be funny. As long as it had a happy, quote-unquote, ending, then it was considered a comedy. Lysistrata is a funny play, so it is unusual in that sense, because they didn't have to be funny. But Lysistrata is quite funny, especially when there's the giant wooden penis element involved in it. if you are interested in that story, there is a way that you can watch a more modern adaptation of it. Spike Lee, a couple of years ago, made a movie called Chirac, which is basically just the plot of Lysistrata, modernized and set in gangland Chicago. So, yeah, there's no giant wooden penises on display, sadly, so I think it lacks power. It's not top tier Spike. It's not Do the Right Thing, Malcolm X Spike. But it's still pretty good. Anyway, so yeah, in the classical world, classic comedy described any play that wasn't a tragedy. So here's how we got to the way that we think about the word comedy these days. The Greeks and Romans, they only used the term comedy specifically in reference to stage plays, right? They didn't have poems or novels that this is a comedic poem or a comedic novel. Yeah. When they used the word comedy, or their equivalent of it, they were using it in reference to plays. Here's what happened. After Greece and Rome kind of go away, during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church takes over a lot of the running of Europe. From about the 5th to 15th centuries, in the Common Era, or AD, the word comedy got broadly changed because, for the Catholic Church, they were really opposed to theater. Partially because they felt that, plays were filthy dirty, and to be fair, a lot of them were. But also, they felt like if you were participating in theater, you were violating one of the 10 Commandments, which was, don't bear false witness, right? The moment that you walk out on stage and say, I'm Batman, well, no, you're not. Enjoy burning in hell, because you just lied. So, yeah, theater goes away for a long, long time. But the way that theater and storytelling kind of survives is that the word comedy gets broadened to apply not only to stage plays during, say, from the year 400 to about the 1400s, it also starts getting applied to long poems, narrative poems, poems that tell a story, right? Because writers aren't writing stage plays, they're now writing these long poems that tell a story that aren't being put on stage, but they're basically plays, right? And these long narrative poems have a happy ending. And typically, those longer narrative poems tended to have a lighter, less serious tone to them. And over time, those poems and plays started to set out more deliberately to provoke a sense of whimsy or amusement from their readers. So much so, in fact, that by the end of this period in history, so the beginning of the 1400s or so, the term comedy has now been enlarged to be an entertainment designed to provoke laughter, mirth, joy, etc. from the audience. So, yeah, originally, comedy, any play that wasn't a tragedy. By the 1400s, a comedy is any sort of entertainment that's deliberately setting out to be funny or to provoke mirth. Not totally the way that we think of it these days, but getting closer. If you're following along, we're on slide 19 now, and yeah, I'm getting to the point, I promise, I know. In the classical sense, a comedy is any play that does not meet the full standards of tragedy as defined by Aristotle. Or, to put it another way, classical comedy is any play that has a happy ending, often ending with the wedding of all major unmarried characters. Like, if characters aren't married at the end of the play, they will turn to each other and say, hey, let's get married, because comedies all end in weddings, in the classical world at least. That holds true even through the 16 and 1700s. Comedies end in weddings. For the modern way that we use that term, a modern comedy is a play characterized by its humorous or satirical tone and its depiction of amusing people or incidents, in which the characters ultimately triumph over adversity, usually, though not always necessarily. Anyway, in the last 2,500 years, since Lysistrata, different styles or types of comedic plays have emerged. The differences lie in terms of the type of humor that's being used, the method of delivery of that humor, the context of humor in a situation. I mean, I am making this too complicated. If you want to understand the difference between comedy and tragedy these days, here you go. Tragedy is what happens to us. Comedy is what happens to other people. So let's say that we were meeting face to face, and you were sitting here bored out of your mind as I lecture on this stuff right now, and like I just turned you off to this subject so much that at the end of class you rush out the front door, down the steps of the library building, which is where this class normally meets, and you trip and fall and break your leg. You're lying there on the ground screaming in pain because your leg's broken. Yeah, I imagine that's going to be pretty tragic to you. That said, one of your reprobate class members, they go out and they watch the whole thing happen, and they're filming the whole thing with their smartphone, and then when they get home, they, take out the sound of you screaming in agony, and they add Looney Tunes sound effects on top of you falling and breaking your leg. They're going to upload that to YouTube, and that shit's going to be hysterically funny. Yeah, tragedy is what happens to us. Comedy is what happens to other people, right? We're going to get into 3 specific types of comedy in just a second in the next video, and I'll give you examples so that you can recognize that type. But yeah, understand the difference between a classical comedy and a modern one, and remember good old Lysistrata.